I discovered who my husband's affair partner was, and instead of falling apart like he must have expected, I made sure to introduce her to her own husband in the most deliberate way possible, because there comes a moment in every woman's life when dignity matters more than silence, and when the truth, no matter how sharp, is the only tool left to restore balance. Before I take you through the entire storm that led me to that unforgettable evening, let me pause for just a moment and speak to you from the heart, because your presence here truly matters to me more than I can express. Every single like, every comment where you share your thoughts or simply say where you're listening from, it feels like a hand reaching through the darkness to let me know I'm not alone in telling these stories. That support is what helps me keep bringing them to life, and if at any point you feel touched or moved by what you hear, I'd be so grateful if you left a small sign of encouragement, because it truly keeps this journey alive. My name is Amelia. I am 32 years old, and for a long time I thought I was living the kind of life I had always dreamed of as a little girl who believed in Sunday routines, handwritten grocery lists, and the comfort of knowing that a man would come home at the same time every evening. I grew up in a modest part of Massachusetts where my mother worked 2 jobs and still found time to bake bread on Saturdays, and I carried that quiet strength into my own marriage. I thought I had found my safe harbor in Oliver, the man who used to leave flowers in the kitchen whenever I had a hard week, the man who once drove 3 hours to pick me up from a conference when my car broke down, the man who had promised me a life built on partnership. From the outside, it must have looked like we were the perfect couple in our early 30s. A decent house with ivy curling along the porch, friends who came by for barbecues in summer, a joint savings account we proudly watched grow as we planned for children. But what no one could see, what I couldn't even allow myself to admit at first, was how easily that perfect picture could crack when small shadows started slipping into our days. At first, it was subtle, almost unremarkable, like the way Oliver no longer asked me how I slept or how my day went, as though the answers had stopped mattering. He would sit at the table with his phone propped against his water glass, eyes flicking down at the screen in a rhythm that stole his attention more thoroughly than I ever could. I told myself it was just work pressure, just stress, because that was the kinder explanation, and kinder explanations are easier to live with. But deep down, I felt the unsettling chill of being slowly erased, of becoming background noise in my own marriage. I tried to smother those feelings with patience, reminding myself of the years we had already shared, of the laughter that had once filled our evenings. But patience began to taste like ashes when the patterns grew sharper. There is a certain cruelty in watching the person you love treat strangers with more warmth than they give you at home. Oliver would brighten at a colleague's text, chuckle at a joke he read aloud, while I sat a few feet away folding laundry, waiting for scraps of attention. I told myself good women endure, that loyalty means weathering hard seasons, that marriage vows are not fair weather promises. But every time I convinced myself to stay silent, a little more of me dissolved, until one evening I realized I was staring at the shadow of my husband instead of the man I thought I knew. That night I lay awake, listening to his breathing beside me, and I felt a strange mix of grief and suspicion coil in my stomach, like smoke looking for a flame. I tried to shake it off, whispering to myself that marriage is a long road with bumps, that maybe this was just one of them. But then came the moment that burned through all illusions. A receipt tucked into his jacket pocket for a boutique hotel downtown, a place neither of us had ever visited together. That tiny piece of paper trembled in my hand, almost laughing at my hesitation, daring me to confront what I had avoided. My chest ached as I thought, what if I am wrong? What if this is just business? What if I humiliate myself with false suspicion? But another part of me, the part that had grown up watching my mother's clear eyes spot lies at a glance, knew there was no mistake. The truth was beginning to pull me toward it whether I wanted to go or not. I stood in our kitchen, that familiar space of morning coffee and weekend pancakes, holding evidence that did not belong in a loyal marriage, and I realized the foundation I had trusted was shifting beneath my feet. What I didn't know then was how far the cracks would spread, or how carefully I would learn to use them to reclaim the dignity I thought I had lost. I want to tell you everything, every detail of how I moved from that moment of grief and disbelief into quiet determination, and how the woman I discovered on the other side of this betrayal became the key to setting myself free. Because when you've been broken down to the silence of enduring, the first spark of truth feels like oxygen, and once you breathe it in, you can never go back. When you live with someone day after day, you learn the shape of their smallest habits, the way they stir sugar into coffee, the rhythm of their footsteps on the stairs, the tone of their laugh when they are genuinely amused. And it is exactly because I knew Oliver so well that the first hairline cracks in our marriage frightened me more than anything. They were not big explosions or obvious betrayals, but small, unkind shifts that whispered of distance where there should have been closeness. He no longer reached for my hand during Sunday drives. He began eating dinner without waiting for me to sit down, and sometimes he even forgot to kiss me goodnight, a ritual that had once felt as natural as breathing. At first, I told myself he was tired, that maybe the stress of his new accounts at work had drained him. But the truth was heavier. It was not exhaustion, it was detachment, and it was growing stronger every day. I remember the first time I caught myself shrinking under his gaze. We were at a dinner with friends, and someone asked him about our plans for the holidays. Instead of answering as a couple, as he always used to, he dismissed me with a shrug and said he would probably have to work, that Amelia can manage something on her own. The table laughed lightly, brushing it off, but my cheeks burned as though someone had poured boiling water down my neck. I laughed too, the kind of brittle laugh women use to cover pain, but deep inside I felt the sting of being sidelined in front of people who once saw us as a team. That night, alone in the bathroom, I pressed a cool cloth to my face and told myself not to make a scene. Good wives don't humiliate their husbands by overreacting, I whispered, even though I was the one humiliated. But humiliations have a way of piling up. Soon there were more dinners eaten in silence, more evenings when he slipped outside to take work calls that stretched into hours. I noticed how quickly he locked his phone, how abruptly he angled the screen away if I walked past. When I asked innocent questions about his day, he snapped that I was being nosy, as though curiosity about your husband's life was a crime. I wanted to believe him. I truly did, but each time I looked at his face, I saw not a man burdened by work, but a man carrying secrets. It is a strange ache, the ache of being erased from someone else's world while you are still lying next to them every night. The turning point came with a faint trace of perfume that was not mine. It clung to the collar of his dress shirt when I took it from the hamper, a sweet floral scent I had never worn. I buried my face in the fabric, hoping I was wrong, but it hit me like a slap. He had been close enough to someone else that her fragrance clung to him longer than my touch did. My hands trembled as I folded that shirt and placed it back in the basket, pretending for a few more hours that nothing was wrong. That night, when he slid into bed beside me, I turned my back, heart racing, but he never noticed. Or maybe he noticed and simply didn't care. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it could have been a client, a crowded elevator, a mistake. But deep down, a part of me was awake now, alert, unwilling to go back to sleep. And it didn't take long for the universe to confirm my fears. One afternoon, while Oliver was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the counter. I wasn't the kind of wife who snooped. I never had been, but my eyes caught the glimpse of a message preview before the screen dimmed. It wasn't the words that froze me, but the heart emoji at the end, something he had not sent to me in months. My chest tightened as I realized how far I had already slipped from his affections. Still, I told myself to wait, to be sure, because maybe there was still an innocent explanation. But suspicion has a way of digging under your skin until you itch with it, until you can't look at your life the same way again. I began to notice how his spending didn't add up, how cash vanished from our joint account without clear reason. I began tracking the receipts he left behind, harmless slips of paper that now felt like breadcrumbs leading me out of the forest of denial. One of them was the final straw, a recurring charge at a downtown boutique hotel, billed under a name I didn't recognize. It appeared not once, but 3 times in the last 2 months, each on weekday afternoons when Oliver was supposed to be locked in his office. I stared at those charges with a sick mix of dread and fury. The evidence was right there, clean as day, and yet I still felt trapped between 2 realities, the one where my husband was faithful and the one where he wasn't. My heart begged me to choose the first, but my eyes dragged me into the second. I wanted to scream, to confront him right there and demand the truth, but something stopped me, a small, sharp instinct that whispered patience. If I was right, if he truly was betraying me, then I needed more than half-seen messages and receipts. I needed clarity. I needed proof. And so I held the secret inside me like a burning coal, waiting for the moment it would ignite. I smiled at him across the dinner table, nodded when he claimed to be working late, kissed him lightly when he left the house. But all the while my mind was racing, tracing patterns, searching for the opening that would expose everything. That opening came sooner than I expected. A week later, while updating our shared tablet, a notification popped up from Oliver's work calendar. It was a dinner appointment scheduled at the very same hotel where those mysterious charges had appeared. My heart slammed in my chest as I stared at the screen, realizing that the pieces of the puzzle were sliding into place, whether I was ready or not. Once the calendar entry appeared on that shared tablet, I could no longer play games with myself, no longer tell sweet little lies about being paranoid or overthinking. I knew exactly where Oliver planned to be, and the quiet sickness that had been simmering inside me began to boil. Still, I said nothing. I kept the knowledge tucked away, and instead, I studied him. And what I saw in those days was not the careful, devoted husband I once thought I had, but a man who had grown sloppy in his deceit, a man who no longer bothered to hide his contempt for the woman who shared his home. His temper changed first. Small questions that once would have earned me a smile or a short explanation now drew sharp responses, as though I were an intruder in my own marriage. If I asked about dinner, he snapped that he had already eaten. If I asked when he might be home, he said I was acting clingy. He made me feel like a burden, like my very presence was something he was forced to endure. I can still hear the tone of his voice on one particular night when I asked if we could spend the weekend together like we used to, maybe take a drive to the coast. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just muttered that he was too busy with real responsibilities, words that cut me to the bone. Real responsibilities, as if I were a child begging for candy instead of a wife asking for time with her husband. And then came the money. At first it was subtle, $50 missing here, $100 there, but soon the amounts grew larger. Withdrawals from our joint account without explanation, credit card charges to places he never mentioned. When I asked, he told me I was mismanaging our finances, that I was always too forgetful to keep track. He twisted reality so smoothly that for a moment I even doubted myself. I began writing everything down, every withdrawal, every receipt, because I refused to let him gaslight me into madness. The more I documented, the more I saw the truth. Money was slipping through our fingers into some hidden part of his life, and it wasn't for us. What hurt most wasn't just the money or the time he stole, but the coldness in his eyes. Oliver used to worry when I had a headache, used to bring me tea when I stayed up late working on reports, used to notice if I was quiet and draw me out with patience. That man was gone. In his place was someone who didn't even see me anymore. He could walk into a room where I sat and act as though I were part of the furniture, not his partner, not the woman he had vowed to cherish. I told myself to be patient, that maybe if I worked harder at being cheerful, if I kept the house spotless, if I smiled through the pain, maybe he would come back to me. But every act of kindness I offered slid off him like water on stone, and I realized that my silence was only giving him more space to disappear. Still, I held back, because if there is one thing betrayal teaches you, It is that the wrong move too early can leave you powerless. And so I became quiet in a different way. I didn't argue when he lashed out. I didn't beg when he pulled away. I simply watched, listened, and wrote everything down. I set up silent alerts on our bank account so every transaction hit my phone before it hit the statements. I turned on location tracking on my own device, subtle enough that he wouldn't notice. I began building a private world of knowledge, brick by brick, while on the outside I played the role of the subdued wife who didn't ask too many questions. It was on a Wednesday afternoon when my quiet system finally gave me the clarity I needed. A ping came to my phone, a charge at the boutique hotel midweek, right when Oliver had claimed he was stuck at a client meeting across town. My heart pounded as I stared at the notification, the letters blurring through my tears. There it was, undeniable, clean and sharp like a knife. He wasn't where he said he was. He wasn't who he claimed to be. And though I felt the familiar ache of grief, I also felt something else rising inside me, something I hadn't felt in months, the beginning of strength. That night, when Oliver returned home smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his, I said nothing. I set the table, I poured him a glass of wine, and I watched him laugh at some joke on his phone while I tucked my proof into the back of my mind. He didn't notice the way my eyes had changed, didn't realize that the woman he had been erasing was quietly sharpening her edges, and he certainly didn't know that I was only days away from uncovering the final piece of the puzzle, the one detail that would make his lies crumble in on themselves. For weeks I had lived in a fog of half-truths and evasions, piecing together fragments that never quite fit, carrying the weight of evidence I dared not yet confront him with. But betrayal, I've learned, has a way of breeding arrogance, and arrogance breeds mistakes. Oliver thought he was clever, thought he was untouchable, and it was that very confidence that finally gave me the sliver of clarity I had been waiting for. It happened on an ordinary evening, when he left his tablet on the kitchen counter while rushing to take a call in the other room. Normally he was cautious, protective of his devices, but this time he didn't bother to log out. A soft chime alerted me to a new entry on his synced work calendar, and when I glanced down, the words froze me in place. Dinner meeting, Riverside Hotel. The very same boutique hotel I had tracked through charges and alerts, the place that had haunted my thoughts for weeks. The calendar didn't just show the time, it showed the address, the room number for the reservation, and even the note confirmed for 2. My hands trembled as I stared at the glowing screen, a pulse of heat rushing through me. There it was, in plain text, without ambiguity, without excuse. Not just suspicion, not just receipts I could question, but his own digital handwriting tying him to the very betrayal I had dreaded. I could almost hear my heartbeat in my ears, a loud, steady thrum that filled the kitchen. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to storm into the next room and throw the tablet at him, demand explanations he couldn't possibly give. But then another instinct, sharper and quieter, rose above the rage. I realized that this was not the moment to explode. This was the moment to watch, to gather, to prepare. Because alongside the calendar entry came something else. His phone, which he must have carelessly synced, backed up one of his photos into our shared cloud for only a few minutes before he caught the mistake and deleted it. But those few minutes were enough for me. I had already saved it. The image was blurry, taken quickly, but clear enough to see him seated at a table, leaning close to a woman with dark hair and a delicate silver ring flashing on her left hand. The way her fingers rested on the stem of her wineglass told me everything. This wasn't business, it wasn't friendship, it was intimacy. I sat frozen with that photo glowing on my screen, my throat dry, my body trembling. For months I had felt invisible, erased, unworthy of the man I had married. But looking at that image, something shifted. I realized that I wasn't weak. I had been patient. I wasn't blind. I was observant. And now I wasn't powerless. I had proof. For the first time in a long time, I felt the faint flicker of control return to my hands. I thought about what it meant. This woman wasn't a nameless stranger. She was real. She wore a ring that suggested vows of her own, and that detail sent my mind spinning. If she was married, then she was betraying not only me, but also her own husband, and suddenly the betrayal doubled in weight. It wasn't just my marriage cracking apart, it was another man's as well. And in that recognition lay the seed of something stronger than grief, the seed of strategy. Still, I didn't act right away. Instead, I sat quietly on the porch that night, listening to the crickets and feeling the cool wood beneath my bare feet, while Oliver laughed inside at something on his phone. I thought about my mother, who had always told me that storms reveal character, that how you respond to cruelty defines you more than the cruelty itself. My hands still shook, but my mind was sharpening. I understood now that rage would only give him more power, that confrontation without preparation would leave me broken. No, I needed to wait, to gather, to learn exactly who this woman was and what her presence in Oliver's life truly meant. So I saved the photo, locked the evidence away, and went back inside with the quiet smile of a woman who knew more than she was letting on. Oliver didn't notice. He never once looked up from his phone to study my face. He had no idea that with one careless mistake, he had handed me the very thread that would unravel everything. And as I slid into bed beside him that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I whispered to myself words I hadn't dared before. This is not the end of me. This is the beginning of him losing everything he thinks he controls. It is a strange feeling to stare at a blurry photograph and realize that the ghost in the background, the woman who had been quietly dismantling the life you thought was safe, is about to become real flesh and blood, with a name, a history, and a life that touches your own in ways you never imagined. For a few days, I avoided the picture altogether, burying it in a hidden folder on my device, because every time I looked at it, I felt a knot of anger and humiliation twist inside me, yet eventually curiosity overpowered fear, and I began to study it like a detective handling evidence, the curve of her dark hair, the outline of her shoulders, the gleam of that delicate silver ring on her left hand. These details became clues, and late at night while Oliver slept beside me with his phone tucked under his pillow, I quietly searched, cross-referencing names, company pages, and social profiles until the scattered fragments fell into place and I finally knew who she was. Her name was Sienna Brooks. She worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown. She was only a few years younger than me, and the most shocking detail of all was that she was married. Her husband's name was Daniel, and together they lived in a polished townhouse with 2 rescue dogs, whose pictures she often posted with cheerful captions. The discovery hit me like a wave, not just because it confirmed my fears, but because it doubled them, expanding betrayal from my marriage into hers, pulling an innocent man into the web without his knowledge. I sat at my kitchen table staring at Sienna's smiling holiday photos with Daniel, both of them wrapped in matching scarves beside a decorated tree, and I felt the sharp sting of injustice on his behalf as well as mine, because he, like me, had been robbed of the trust he had placed in his partner. What unsettled me most was how normal everything looked, how carefully curated her life appeared online, filled with brunch snapshots and anniversary dinners, while behind that glossy surface she was slipping into hotel rooms with Oliver, dismantling 2 families at once with the ease of someone ordering wine by the glass. I thought of the silver ring, a symbol meant to represent vows as sacred as the ones on my own finger, and I wondered how she could wear it so casually while betraying everything it was supposed to mean. Yet even as my chest ached with anger, a new clarity began to form, because the moment Sienna became real, with a name and a husband, the path before me shifted from helpless grief into something resembling strategy. I realized that if Oliver thought he could erase me quietly, if Sienna thought she could step into my place without consequence, then both of them had underestimated me profoundly. For the first time I felt not just like a victim, but like a woman holding a card they had left exposed, and the more I thought about Daniel, about his unsuspecting loyalty, the more I understood that there was power in truth, not the kind of truth shouted in anger, but the kind revealed calmly, precisely, in a way that could never be undone. I didn't yet know exactly how or when I would use that truth, but the seed had been planted, and with it came the first stirrings of control I hadn't felt in months. I printed 4 clean pages that evening, each one documenting the charges, the calendar entry, the photo, and a short timeline with dates that matched his so-called client meetings, and I slid them into a folder labeled simply Truth. It wasn't much, not a dramatic collection of evidence that could make a courtroom tremble, but it was enough to confirm everything I needed, enough to hold in my hands when I doubted myself, and enough to remind me that I wasn't powerless anymore. Oliver came home late that night, humming to himself as if life were perfectly in order, and kissed my cheek with a distracted smile, never noticing that just behind me, in the drawer of the hallway cabinet, rested the quiet beginning of the plan that would one day unravel both his lies and hers. And as I drifted off to sleep beside him, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I whispered to myself that the next time I looked Sienna in the eyes, it would not be in secret and it would not be with fear. When I first held that folder in my hands, thin and unassuming yet heavy with meaning, I realized that proof alone was not enough, because evidence without boundaries can still leave you exposed, and I had no intention of handing Oliver the chance to twist my reality again. So I took a quiet step that felt both terrifying and liberating. I visited a small legal clinic in town that offered free consultations, and though I trembled as I described vague suspicions rather than every sordid detail, the woman across from me, a lawyer with kind eyes and a no-nonsense tone, explained what documentation mattered, what financial moves I could make without alerting him, and what rights were mine to protect. Her calm words gave me something I had been missing for months, the assurance that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't overreacting, that betrayal was not just emotional, but practical, and that there were ways to shield myself if things collapsed. I left with pamphlets and notes tucked discreetly into my bag, and though no one who saw me on the street that day would have guessed, I carried with me a new sense of quiet strength. Still, strength is a fragile thing when carried alone, and I knew I needed at least one person in my corner, someone who would believe me without judgment. That person was my cousin Nora, older by 10 years, steady as an oak, the kind of woman who always carried tissues in her purse and spoke truths you didn't want to hear, but needed nonetheless. One evening, over tea at her kitchen table, while her children worked on homework in the next room, I told her everything, from the perfume on his shirt to the photo on the tablet, and I saw the sorrow flash across her face, not surprise, but the pain of recognition. She listened without interruption, then placed her hand over mine and said that silence could be a weapon if used wisely, that rushing into confrontation might satisfy my anger, but would not restore my dignity. In that moment I felt both lighter and stronger, because I no longer carried the burden alone, and having her witness to my truth made me feel less like a ghost in my own life. Meanwhile, Oliver's behavior continued to escalate in ways that might have crushed me months earlier, but now only confirmed my path. He grew sharper in his criticisms, nitpicking my cooking, my clothes, even the way I breathed too loudly at night, as though dismantling me piece by piece could justify his own betrayal. He picked fights at odd hours, stormed out without explanation, and then returned with the smug calm of a man who believed his lies were unassailable. But instead of crumbling, I began to record. I noted dates, times, expenses, and remarks, not for revenge in the heat of anger, but for clarity in the cold light of truth. I built a private record that turned his attempts at chaos into patterns I could see clearly, and with each entry, I felt less like a powerless wife and more like a woman quietly weaving a net around a man who didn't even realize he was already ensnared. And yet amid all this, I found myself thinking of the strangers who might one day hear my story, women who had endured their own silent humiliations, and I wanted to speak to them, to you, from the heart. If you are listening now, I need you to know how much your presence matters to me, because sharing this journey is not easy, and yet every like, every comment, every simple word of encouragement is a light I carry through the dark. When you tell me where you're listening from, it feels like a map of support stretching across the world, reminding me that none of us are truly alone in our struggles. That connection gives me courage to keep telling the truth, even when it hurts, and to keep walking toward the justice I know is waiting. And as I closed my notebook that night, the record of Oliver's disdain etched neatly in ink, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. The strangest part of betrayal is how ordinary life continues to march forward, how invitations still arrive in the mail, how calendars still fill with events, as though the foundation of your marriage has not already cracked wide open. It was through one of these invitations that the idea of a stage for the truth first presented itself to me. Oliver had been pressuring me to skip a local charity gala, claiming it was tedious, that I never enjoyed those kinds of evenings, but something in the sharpness of his insistence set my instincts on edge. So I opened the invitation, tucked on the counter, and saw the list of sponsors, and there, printed neatly among them, was the company where Sienna worked. In that moment, the pieces clicked together. The gala wasn't tedious to him at all. It was convenient. It was safe. A place where he could hover near her, under the cover of polished suits and polite laughter. My pulse quickened because I realized I had just found the perfect stage for what would one day become their undoing. I began my quiet rehearsal long before the evening itself, moving like someone studying a script she would one day perform. I RSVP'd yes with calm politeness, letting Oliver believe I was being accommodating, and then I contacted the event coordinator with a small request, a change in our seating, framed as a simple donor perk. They accepted without hesitation, and with that small adjustment, I ensured our table would be placed directly beside Sienna and Daniel's. The thought of sitting within arm's reach of them made my stomach twist, yet beneath the fear pulsed a steady thrill of anticipation, because there was something deeply satisfying about planning a confrontation, not through screaming matches, but through the slow, deliberate positioning of chairs at a banquet table. During those days of preparation, I studied every detail with the patience of someone arranging pieces on a chessboard. I learned from public records which causes Sienna's firm supported. I traced the guest list through press releases, and I mapped out the schedule of the evening so I would know exactly when people's attention would be focused on polite chatter rather than the speeches on stage. The more I rehearsed it in my mind, the more certain I became that this was not just about exposing Oliver's betrayal, but about doing it in a way that left no room for denial, no space for gaslighting or twisted justifications. I wanted their own arrogance to collapse around them, not through my rage, but through their own carelessness, meeting daylight in front of witnesses. It was not revenge born of chaos, but justice delivered with precision. What Oliver never realized in those days was that his attempts to control me, dismissing my questions, brushing off my presence, treating me as though my silence was weakness, only fueled my determination to choose this moment carefully. He believed he was safe, believed he could laugh in his phone in the evenings while I washed dishes, never noticing the way my eyes had shifted from wounded to watchful. And in a way, that ignorance was my greatest advantage, because a man who underestimates his wife never sees the trap being built beneath his feet. As I folded the gown I planned to wear across my bedspread and placed my printed notes into my bag, I felt the first quiet swell of triumph. The rehearsal was done, the stage was set, and soon enough the curtain would rise on the truth neither Oliver nor Sienna had ever expected to face. In the days leading up to the gala, I felt as though I were living two lives at once, one visible and one hidden, and the contrast between them grew sharper with every passing hour. On the surface, I played the part of the dutiful wife, moving through dinners, errands, and polite conversations, nodding at Oliver's excuses about late meetings and long hours, never letting my face betray the storm that raged beneath. But in private, I was building my safety net, placing quiet boundaries between us that he would not see until it was too late. I had already separated my personal savings from our joint accounts, stashing away funds in a discreet credit union account under my name only, and I packed a small bag with essentials, documents, a change of clothes, the folder of proof, tucking it neatly under a blanket in the trunk of my car. That bag was not for running away in shame, but for stepping forward with clarity, and knowing it was there gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. Oliver, blind in his arrogance, continued to behave as though nothing in our marriage had shifted, which only made his lies easier to map. One evening he announced with studied nonchalance that he would be working late again, and I simply nodded, offering no resistance, which startled him more than anger ever could. For the first time, I saw unease flicker across his face, as though my silence unsettled him more than my questions once did. What he didn't know was that his alibi had already collapsed under my quiet scrutiny, because the hotel charges, the calendar entries, and the photo had painted a picture too precise to ignore. Instead of screaming at him or demanding explanations, he would twist into more lies. I let him think he was still in control, all the while tightening the circle of truth around him. His words no longer wounded me. They exposed him, and each careless excuse only made the net stronger. As the evening of the gala drew closer, I rehearsed not only what I would say, but how I would carry myself, because I understood that tone mattered as much as content, and I wanted my composure to be the sharpest weapon of all. I imagined the moment again and again, the glint of surprise in Sienna's eyes, the confusion in Daniel's, the sudden collapse of Oliver's confident facade, and I reminded myself that the power lay not in shouting accusations, but in calmly introducing people who should never have needed an introduction. That was the heart of my plan. A single sentence, spoken lightly, that would drop the truth like a stone into still water and let the ripples spread on their own. It required no theatrics, no outburst, only timing and restraint, and the thought of delivering it with a steady voice filled me with a strange, quiet satisfaction that steadied my nerves. On the morning of the gala, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, fastening the clasp of my necklace with hands that trembled only slightly, and I looked into my own reflection with a mixture of fear and pride. I wasn't the same woman who had once begged for scraps of attention or questioned her own worth in the shadow of his contempt. I had become someone sharper, someone calmer, someone who knew that dignity was not found in how others treated you, but in how you carried yourself when the truth finally arrived. As I placed the slim folder into my evening bag, I felt a surge of strength course through me, because the final pieces were in place, the trap was set, and no matter what unfolded that night, I knew I would walk away with my head held high. The goodbyes I was preparing to make were not to Oliver's lies, but to the version of myself who had ever believed them. The ballroom glowed with the soft shimmer of chandeliers, the air thick with the hum of polite conversation and the clinking of glasses, and as I stepped through the doors in my gown, I felt as though I were walking onto a stage I had been rehearsing for weeks. My heartbeat thundered, but outwardly I carried myself with the poise of someone arriving to enjoy an ordinary evening. Oliver, already mingling with colleagues near the bar, glanced up at me, and for a fleeting moment I caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, as though he sensed I was no longer the woman he thought he could manage with silence. I crossed the room with steady steps, greeted acquaintances with polite smiles, and let him believe that nothing was amiss, even as the folder in my bag pressed lightly against my side like a secret weapon waiting for its moment. When the ushers guided us to our table, my careful planning revealed itself, because there across the white linen sat Sienna and Daniel, her smile bright, his demeanor relaxed, both of them entirely unaware of what the evening would hold. Oliver stiffened at the sight, his jaw tightening for a second before he smoothed his expression, but I caught it, and I savored it, because it was the first crack in his mask of control. The four of us exchanged polite greetings, the kind of empty pleasantries that float across banquet tables, but under the surface my nerves hummed with electricity. I studied Sienna carefully, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the ring flashing on her finger, the light laugh she offered Daniel when he made a small joke, and I felt no urge to lash out, only the calm certainty that soon enough she would be forced to face the reality she had been so carefully hiding, The moment came between courses, when the chatter around us had softened into a comfortable murmur, and eyes were turned more toward wine glasses than the stage. I leaned slightly toward Sienna, my tone light and neighborly, and spoke her full name clearly enough for Daniel to hear. Then, with a gentle smile, I thanked her for looking after Oliver during his repeated evenings at the Riverside Hotel, mentioning dates that matched precisely the charges I had saved. For a heartbeat, the words seemed to hover in the air, almost invisible, and then they landed, heavy and irrevocable, rippling through the table with the quiet force of a stone dropped in still water. Daniel's head snapped toward her, confusion clouding his features, while Oliver's hand tightened so sharply around his glass that I thought it might shatter, and Sienna, pale beneath her flawless makeup, froze as though every muscle in her body had forgotten how to move. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I didn't even look angry. I simply placed the folded page from my bag beside Daniel's hand, a single sheet listing dates and places, and then excused myself softly to step away for a moment. Around us, nearby guests who had overheard began to shift in their chairs, whispers rising like a tide, the silence spreading wider than I could have orchestrated if I had tried. Oliver reached for me, his lips parting with words that would never be enough, but I had already risen, my steps steady as I walked toward the corridor outside the ballroom. My heart raced, my palms tingled, yet my face remained calm, because I knew in that instant the damage was complete, and nothing he could say or do would ever gather those words back into secrecy. The truth had been spoken, clean and undeniable, and now it belonged not just to me, but to everyone who had witnessed it. The corridor outside the ballroom was hushed compared to the rising whispers behind me, and for a brief moment I stood alone beneath the golden sconces, drawing in long breaths as though my lungs were relearning how to expand after months of suffocation. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and wine, yet beneath it all I tasted freedom, because for the first time since the shadows of betrayal had entered my life, I had spoken the truth aloud, and there was no way to bury it again. My hands still trembled, but the trembling came not from fear, but from the release of pressure that had been building for too long, and I let myself feel the weight slide from my shoulders as though I had shed a cloak I never agreed to wear. It didn't take long for Oliver to follow, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble as he hurried after me. His voice strained with urgency as he called my name. He tried to grab my arm, but I stepped aside with quiet steadiness, meeting his frantic eyes with the calm of someone who no longer feared him. His words tumbled out in excuses, half-formed apologies, accusations twisted into pleas, but I heard them all as nothing more than noise, the desperate scramble of a man whose mask had finally cracked in front of the very people he wanted to impress. I answered only once, my voice low and clear, telling him that dignity was something earned, not borrowed, and that I would no longer waste mine on someone who had thrown his away so carelessly. The way he recoiled at my composure, as though the absence of anger wounded him more than rage ever could, told me he understood that the power had shifted and would never return to his hands. I walked past him without looking back, my heels steady against the marble, and moved through the lobby toward the car I had parked earlier that evening. The bag I had prepared weeks ago waited in the trunk, small and discreet, containing everything I needed to step away without hesitation, and sliding behind the wheel felt like stepping into a new version of myself. I drove through the quiet streets, with the city lights flickering across the windshield, the sound of my own breathing loud in the silence, and though tears finally slipped down my cheeks, they tasted clean, not bitter, because they were not born of weakness, but of release. Each block that carried me farther from the ballroom felt like a block closer to freedom, and by the time I reached my cousin Nora's house, I knew I had crossed an invisible line that could never be reversed. Nora opened her door before I had even knocked twice, her eyes soft with understanding as she pulled me inside without questions. I sank onto her couch, the familiar scent of lavender in her living room wrapping around me like a blanket, and for the first time in months, I let myself exhale, without fear of what waited behind me. The phone on the table buzzed with messages, Oliver's name lighting up the screen with frantic calls and long, desperate texts, but I didn't touch it. Instead, I placed it face down and listened to the hum of Nora's kettle in the kitchen, the comforting domestic sound of life continuing without lies, and I realized that I was no longer the woman he could gaslight or dismiss. I had spoken the truth. I had taken my step into freedom, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, I knew with every beat of my heart that the balance had flipped for good. In the days that followed the gala, the fallout unfolded with a swiftness that even I had not fully anticipated. Because secrets exposed in public do not dissolve quietly. They spread like wildfire, igniting every dry corner of the lives built upon them. Oliver tried desperately to reach me, flooding my phone with messages that swung wildly between apologies, accusations, and pathetic declarations of love. But I ignored them all, letting each unanswered call remind him that his words no longer had a home in my life. At work, his absence did not go unnoticed, because the whispers from the gala had already begun weaving through his office corridors, and soon enough, he was summoned by his firm's senior partners, who demanded explanations about conflicts of interest and inappropriate client relationships. Within a week, he was placed on leave, pending investigation, the career he had guarded so jealously unraveling with the same arrogance that had once made him careless. Sienna fared no better, because Daniel was not a man who tolerated betrayal dressed up as charity dinners. The moment I had placed the folded sheet in his hand, a fracture split open in their marriage, and by the next morning he had confronted her with the kind of cold, precise fury only a betrayed spouse can muster. Word spread quickly through her company, where colleagues who had seen her with Oliver at the gala whispered behind closed doors, and within days she was reassigned quietly, stripped of the prestigious accounts she had flaunted, the life she had polished so carefully online, the anniversary photos, the smiling brunch posts, the matching scarves, now rang hollow because the truth had leaked into every corner of her world and no filter could erase it. The irony was sharp. The very public spaces she had used to showcase perfection became the silent witnesses to her downfall. For me, the aftermath felt both surreal and cleansing, because while their worlds cracked under the weight of exposure, I was finally stepping into the kind of peace I had longed for. I signed the lease on a modest apartment across town, furnished it slowly with secondhand treasures and fresh flowers, and found comfort in the small rituals that were entirely mine. I walked through markets with no one criticizing my choices. I cooked dinners that I savored in silence, and at night I slept deeply, no longer waiting for a door to open late with excuses that smelled of lies. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, and in that simplicity I felt richer than I ever had in the house where Oliver's contempt had suffocated me. Each morning I opened the window to let sunlight stream across my bed, and I told myself that this light belonged to me alone now, not shared with anyone who had betrayed it. And yet, even in my new beginning, reminders of what I had endured flickered into view. A text from Daniel appeared one evening, not angry or pleading, but filled with quiet gratitude for the dignity with which I had revealed the truth. He said that, while his heart was broken, he was thankful that I had chosen calm precision over chaos, and that simple message touched me deeply, because it affirmed what I had believed all along, that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers clearly in the right ears at the right moment. Knowing that he too was walking his own path away from deceit gave me a sense of solidarity, a reminder that we had both been wounded but had chosen not to let the wounds define us. And as I put down the phone and looked around my little apartment, I realized that though betrayal had tried to strip me of everything, in the end it had left me with the one thing that mattered most, the strength to rebuild on my own terms. With each passing week, the noise of the scandal faded from the edges of my life, and in its place came a quiet rhythm that felt almost foreign after so many months of tension. I woke each morning to sunlight spilling across my modest bedroom, brewed coffee in a pot that belonged only to me, and filled the silence with music instead of the sound of Oliver's dismissive sighs. My new apartment was small, but every corner reflected my choices. The books stacked neatly by the window, the vase of fresh flowers I replaced every Saturday, the photographs of my family that reminded me I was loved long before betrayal tried to convince me otherwise. It was not luxury, it was not perfection, but it was honest, and in that honesty I found more comfort than I had ever known in the polished lie of my marriage. Oliver, meanwhile, became little more than a shadow drifting at the edges of gossip, stripped of the respect he had once demanded and abandoned by the colleagues who had once praised him. Sienna, too, shrank from the bright social stage she had cultivated, her reputation dimmed not by my hands, but by the consequences of her own choices. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that neither of them had escaped unscathed, but more than satisfaction, there was peace, because their downfall had cost me nothing more than calm truth, spoken at the right time in the right place. I had not screamed, I had not begged, I had not humiliated myself. I had simply introduced a woman to her own husband and let the truth do the rest. Sometimes justice is not loud, sometimes it is elegant in its simplicity, leaving no doubt about where the blame truly lies. Looking back, I realized that betrayal had given me a gift I never expected. The reminder that my worth was never measured by someone else's loyalty, but by the strength I carried when loyalty was broken. I no longer saw myself as the woman who endured in silence, shrinking under the weight of his lies, but as the woman who rose, gathered the pieces of truth, and chose to walk away with dignity intact. The moral was simple, almost old-fashioned, yet powerful in its clarity. Never set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, because those who would let you burn do not deserve your light. Life has a way of returning balance, of revealing truths in the open, and when it does, the only task left to us is to stand tall enough to let the light fall where it belongs. And so, as I share this journey with you now, I want to thank you from the depths of my heart for walking it beside me, because your presence here is not something I take lightly. Every like you leave, every comment where you share your thoughts, or simply where you are listening from, it feels like a chorus of voices reminding me, and reminding women like me, that none of us stand alone in the storms we face. If this story has touched you, if it has reminded you of your own strength or offered a moment of recognition, I would be grateful beyond words if you let me know by adding your voice below. Together we carry these truths forward, and together we remind the world that betrayal does not get the final word. Dignity does, strength does, and justice, in its quiet, undeniable way, always finds its place.